our next session, which is a topic called Guardrails for Genius, Governance Frameworks in the AI-Enabled University. So I'll be inviting to the stage our expert panel, which consists of Dr. Humberto Hernandez Ariza, Ethan Wicker, and Dr. Melissa McIntire. Ari is our moderator once again, so I turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Of course. Thank you, Callista. And hello, everyone. Once again, good morning. I'm Ariana Torres from LAPU, and I'll be moderating this session. Once again, the title is Guardrails for Genius, Governance Frameworks in the AI-Enabled University. Because as we know, AI is moving fast from experimentation to becoming embedded in how we teach, learn, and really just operate. But with that does come some tension, some questions that are coming up, which we hope to explore and discuss today. And again, this can be really centered around the thought of how do we create governance that protects integrity, privacy, and trust, without, of course, slowing down the innovation or over-restricting, the exploration. So today's conversation will definitely be finding that middle path. We'll be doing our best to discuss that along with different systems that can actually work. So I'll kick it off here. We can start with the big picture, and whoever decides to jump in, please feel free to do so. But again, AI is becoming foundational in higher education. So what breaks first if governance doesn't keep up? So what is at stake? What can we see breaking and maybe needing a little more attention if we're unable to see the governance keeping up with that innovation? Dr. Melissa
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. So starting really in the K-12 world, last year we had met with our principals and just talked about what was coming down the pipeline with AI and how fast it's moving. And if we don't get ahead of the game, kids are going to use it incorrectly and they're not going to have those guardrails. So we put in an AI initiative, K-12, and really focused hard on like 3-12, but still introduced our kids. And with that being said, so we started training. I trained our whole admin team, and then we trained our teachers. And then going into next school year, we're looking at starting training our students. Now we have introduced them to some educational AI tools. Which has been very successful for us. I do have a success story, which is amazing. I have a dual credit English teacher, and she came to me one day early last year, and she goes, "I don't believe in AI, but I trust you, and I would love to hear everything you're doing in the AI world." And so I talked to her about what I was working on my thesis, which was the challenges and opportunities of AI and educational leadership within school systems. And after I introduced her to the tool, her class wrote the essay, and then they were using different generators, and they ended up creating a children's book, and now they're selling it on Amazon. So like that's one success story. And I've had the opportunity to sit at Purdue University as we have currently developing policies to set those guardrails in for students as well. So it's been amazing, honestly, because I think when you do things, when you try to get ahead of that ball game, then it makes things a lot easier when we teach kids how to do things and we set those guardrails.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you, Melissa, for sharing that, and then thank you to our audience, and thank you, Ariana, for the questions. I wanted just to share a general perspective as what we see from I guess the transition from K-12 to what is happening in higher education. I think what has happened is I think what breaks first, is sometimes institutional trust. Some faculty members, at least, what I realize is that they stop really trusting assessment or the assessment that they have put together historically. Students even stop, trusting, fairness, if you will. What does that mean? What does that mean if faculty can also utilize AI to grade, right? And we would say that, leaders also stop trusting the data then, because then it's like, oh, students are, saying that this is happening, faculty saying that this is happening. Is this all AI? So what's the data behind this? And I would say that even, some staff really, they start to improvise, in inconsistent ways, and I guess once that happens, really the institution as a whole is really no longer like managing AI, but adoption, but it's really trying to react to these fragmented AI behaviors across the university campus. And I imagine that this relates a lot to K-12 too. But when that governance and AI governance really lags, I usually put these things in 5 boxes. Five failures could happen very quickly. One, there is of course inconsistent practice, because of course every department will create its unofficial rules, AI rules, right? So we notice this a lot with our institution, right? Before we put a lot of our AI governance in place, we were like, oh yeah, psychology has its own AI policy, math has its own AI policy, the department, the admissions team has its own AI policy. So there were a lot of inconsistency practices around what AI governance was. The second one was a lot of privacy risks. Of course, we saw a lot of people sometimes starting to enter sensitive information into tools without sometimes understanding, some data controls and more. So I think, that also was a failure of when the governance in AI lags. The third one I would say is, the academic integrity confusion, right? So institutions, that have not clarified really what counts as support versus substitution, they face a lot of that tension between students and faculty. I would say also a fourth one is, perhaps the over reliance, perhaps, where AI really becomes that cognitive crutch, rather than really using it as a learning support. And again, when there is no guardrails and there's no governance, then hey, what breaks is that too. And I would say the fifth one and last one is kind of the leadership, perhaps, shift or drift, if you will, like where really nobody is really clearly accountable for the decisions, right? So like when a student complains saying like, what am I getting a 0? And the faculty saying, because this is AI generated. And the student says, well, proof that it's AI generated, and there is nobody to say, is it AI generated or not? So like, so there is no governance and there is no leadership drift to say, this is the policy that says that, this is the escalation policy or more. So there is a lot of that. So yeah, I would say that that's a lot of the works that, break because of lack of AI governance. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for walking us through that. Ethan, was there something you'd like to share or touch on? Yeah.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Awesome to be here. To kind of go off this trust piece, I think we should acknowledge that in North America, depends on the survey, 40 to 60% of people have a negative view of this technology. Tends to be a bit higher in Latin America, South America, parts of Asia. But here in North America, it's, half and half, kind of do and don't like it. At the same time, right, the tools are getting better. What we can do with the tools are expanding. So you can have this like, we're doing more stuff. People don't understand how exactly we're doing this. And there's this negative view that can lead to like a trust spiral that kind of, people have this negative experience, negative reaction, both family, the student, instructors, the whole thing that we don't talk enough about, in my opinion.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. That was excellent. And I think when you're talking too about the statistics and you're looking by 2030, 67% of jobs are going to be changed. That's a lot because you're talking about your current freshmen in whatever graduation pathway that they're on. Are they even going to be ready for what's going to hit them next in college? So yeah, that was excellent.
Mm-hmm. And what I took away, again, from all of your answers is that maybe there's hesitation of using AI because someone might feel that they're not going to be an independent thinker, they're going to begin to rely on it, or they're just skeptical. So of course, that's all valid. But would love to know, if what structures and roles do we feel can really support this and maybe kind of demystify some of those fears? Are there, flexible policies that can be added, that can evolve with AI as it continues to change? Would love any thoughts on that, anything that comes up.
I can hop in here. For context, I manage all the data for Nectir. We provide higher education institutions with AI technology. I publish some studies and so forth. And I kind of see two things here that need to happen. When you think deeply about privacy in this regard, are the messages to an AI bot assistant agent, pick your word, is that private information? Should it be for a parent or an instructor or an admin? This is kind of a case-by-case, tool-by-tool approach, but rarely in education have we said that this is absolutely private, even though it's related to me learning calculus. And maybe here we should. Maybe here this is a different step in that direction. And if so, what is the data structure and the data infrastructure to support that? And the second one that we're exploring is there is a FERPA studies exemption. That I'm not a lawyer. Please go look at that yourself. But this can be a flexible pattern with proper agreements in place to do research in a quick way without a huge amount of regulation.
Awesome. I could share a complementary perspective, unless you want to go, Melissa.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. No, and thank you. Thank you for that, Ethan. I mean, I think as you were mentioning some of that, I see, from what I see, I usually put those in buckets in roles, so sometimes I feel like, hey, we need an institutional owner, a domain-specific owner, a cross-functional governance mechanism that can help with all of this. So, and I say sometimes that at a minimum, sometimes we just need also an executive, sponsorship that could centralize, these conversations sometimes through some committees or governance leads, so that conversations like what you're saying in terms of data and more can really, can support, the work of AI in institutions. So kind of just perhaps elaborating more on that, when I think about, what academics leaders are doing for teaching and of course, in the midst of all of these AI revolution, if you will, we need those bodies, and those owners to really set sometimes the pace of how this is going to look like in academic affairs, how this is really going to look in student affairs, in enrollment management, in even in HR, employment practices and more. So there is so much of that I feel like, we need the responsible domain-specific owner and the institutional owner to, in case that a case, quote unquote, gets out of hand, we need the responsible body or the responsible person that can say, this is how we apply policy, or this is the final decision, so that, again, governance is not weakened by perhaps by just saying, oh no, this is just AI implementation and we just have to live with it, as opposed to having guardrails put in place. So yeah.
Thank you so much all for sharing your insight on this. I do want to shift a little bit, again, leaning more into this topic. Would love to just ask, what is it that we're trying to protect? Because governance ultimately exists to preserve trust. So how do you believe that we can rethink academic integrity in an AI-enabled world? How can we what can we prioritize? If there's, again, any data that we're looking into as we see AI continuing to evolve in learning? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to the K-12 world there as well. Yes. I think we can go back to, remember when the calculators were invented and everybody's like, oh no, like kids are going to be using those, to cheat. And then comes Google, and then, Siri and maps. So as much as that's evolved, I really think it's that comfort level and being able to speak to, if we're uploading an assignment that they have written and we upload their rubric to grade them, and it tells you in paragraph 5 you need to correct 7 grammatical errors, and in paragraph 3 you didn't use voice. I think that's an excellent thing, because universities teach to mastery, and we should be teaching our K-12 to mastery as well, to get them ready for that college and career piece. So I think that goes back even to our earlier conversation of having that trust and building that trust, and where people don't feel that our kids, are cheating. There's definitely ways for us to show them how to use it and how to use it effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, keeping an eye on it becoming harmful dependence, but also not so much, over focusing on cheating, and under focusing on something else. So if there are any other real world examples or thoughts on this, again, on, keeping that healthy relationship with AI, and knowing that it's going to continue to evolve, especially our relationship and just the innovation behind it. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I got something worth thinking a lot about is, at this point, the learning sciences and pedagogy are quite well established. There's research on how best to teach mathematics and calculus and English and XYZ, right? And, it's not a hard science, but it's a science, it's not an art. And so we're thinking about that in conjunction with the technology has gotten good enough where they can follow these practices.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have a lesson on limits or on mitochondria in the cell, right? And the quote best way or an optimal way to teach that is, it's established. Like, how do we build that into the tool? So it's kind of sort of followed always. We use this term Socratic, which I think is kind of a catch-all for this. But what's that mean for a particular, instructor in a particular course type? And how do we quote like bake in that technology or bake in that ability? I think there are ways of doing this. If you kind of zoom out, people in like the coding world have been doing this for a year, with agents.md and cloud.md files. Can we do something similar with like a teaching mitochondria, or educational psychology, and kind of like force, if you will, that governance on the teaching itself?
I would love to piggyback to that answer, and I love you mentioned learning sciences, Ethan. I think at the beginning you were asking Arena, like the question was like, what do we need to protect? And I feel from my point of view, there are hard boundaries in terms of, like, of course, protection of data, high stake decisions, things that relates to deception or others that AI could have already baked in. Hey, we have to put hard boundaries on that. And another hard boundary is exactly on what you were mentioning too, Ethan. Learning, and specifically learning science. We have to protect that pedagogical aspect behind it. So I guess from a learning science perspectives, we have to protect that some level of productive struggle is needed. I think that's important. I feel like a lot of faculty members tend to miss that, and of course the students don't know the learning science to name it as it is, but the desirable difficulty theory behind the creation of assessments matters, because that deep learning really depends on that retrieval practice that happens from your brain, not retrieving from the screen of ChatGPT, but like retrieving from your brain, like that sense making and that transfer of knowledge, and that effort that takes to construct the understanding. I think that we have to protect that. We have to protect that learning science and put really hard, I would say, like iron and really thick, walls around that, because here's where, of course, the conversation about academic integrity in this AI-enabled world becomes an authorship kind of like issue, in terms. So it's really about preserving the integrity of what the learning process in itself is and how students get there. So that path to learning, I think is so important, and we have to make it like learning AI-proof. And I talked a lot about, desirable difficulty and andragogy practices applied to assessments and more with our different faculty members, because that's what intrinsically motivates the student to complete the assessment, right? I'm not sure 100% how that looks like in K-12, and I'm so glad that Melissa's here. But, in higher education, instead of talking about pedagogy, we talk about andragogy, where students intersect their culture, their jobs, their work readiness, and so many other things that could go for forever on. But, there is a lot of that, right? And on top of that, we have to rethink and redesign assignments in so many different ways around process, oral defense, and I think we have to be honest about, the process of what learning and learning design and assessment design, would mean, reflection, iteration of processes, applied transfer, I would just say even like transparency in the use of AI, because it doesn't mean that we cannot use AI, right? It means how do we use it intentionally to ensure that it's actually building on the learning process and the learning science and the andragogy, as opposed to, oh, let me just take the shortcut. This is not meaningful. I'm just gonna use ChatGPT.
Yeah, well said. And I like the direction that we're heading in. And I think we can bring this back to balance, because this is also maybe something that institutions are really struggling for. And my question, something I'd love for us to continue to discuss is, how can we continue to support faculty and students without overwhelming them, knowing that we're encouraging experimentation, but we don't want them to lose control. And again, being mindful of keeping the integrity of the ethics behind everything. So any thoughts on that, how we can support our staff, our faculty, and the students?
Yeah, maybe on the student front, something we think about is what information should we return back to the user, to the student? If a student has sent, 5,000 messages, over 100 conversations over 3 months to their history, 101 assistant, like, what do we give back to them, both for their own metacognition, for their own understanding, for their own analysis of, like, should I have sent 5,000 messages? And maybe as a tangential point is there's this idea of like memory in these systems, and oftentimes it's a document, a Word document or a Markdown document. And like, is this memory document private? Should we share that with the instructor? In under 18 in K-12, of course you should, but for a 25-year-old grad student, like, it's not so clear to me at what point the privacy versus transparency line is with regard to that.
Yeah, that's a very important an interesting topic and an idea that we definitely need to discuss. Any thoughts, Dr. Melissa, Dr. Humberto?
I do have thoughts. I was going to say, hey, Melissa, do you want to go in this one? I didn't want to.
Yeah, this is, definitely a field that we can dive into. But yeah, we have a few minutes, so please do share any thoughts coming up.
Sure, I could share, I think something important about, because this session is about governance, I can tell you also that, we make experimentation. We were very intentional at our institution to make experimentation part of governance. So a lot of the times, we think about, all the guardrails that, hey, but we're going to experiment out of these LLMs that control the data, right? People start thinking about the exceptions, right, in the governance, but we really baked in experimentation as part of ours. And what that means is that we really want people to innovate and bring in, all of those out of the box ideas and tools that, hey, may not comply with all the data features that we have, but what if it helps the student learn? What if it helps the faculty member? And what if it makes sense for the institution, So like, so that is baked into our governance pieces and our tenants, as we call them. And that sometimes takes shapes in terms of, very, very low risk pilots with clear scopes, of course, and limited data environments that even, that we're like, all this data is going to go out, and we're like, okay, well, it's part of our experimentation phase, an experimentation tenant, I think, with the defined success measures that we have put around this and the documented lessons, we can take a hit, if you will, let's call it in some way, in terms of what this could look like to ensure that our experimentation is is still alive, right? Again, everything through a very structured pilot, and kind of really allowing institutions and allowing our departments and faculty members, staff members, and even students, to really test some value, of course, before scaling, but also to generate, qualitative or quantitative data that could show as evidence that, hey, look, like, I know that this tool may not be the most compliant, or this framework or this approach may not be the most compliant for our data practices, but believe it or not, it's working. So, if we have data showing that it's going to help our students, going to help our faculty, staff, institutions as a whole, well, I think we have to have all the conversations around, how do we mold things around that? So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. Would love for the three of you to kind of just share and bring to mind if there was one essential guardrail that every institution should have before scaling their AI. And again, this is with the idea that they're already taking into consideration all the feedback, and have had that time to really assess the relationship that students, that staff and faculty have with this tool. Is there something that comes to mind, maybe an essential, again, guardrail that they can set in place before they continue to see it evolve? Maybe there's a real life experience or feedback that you've received that can tie into this.
I think for the K-12 world, when you're talking about, governance really defines direction and boundaries, right? So at its core, in a K-12 system, your school board is in partnership with your superintendent, which establishes policies and procedures and how to clarify AI and how you're going to use it to meet instruction or assessment or communication and operations. So we've been working on developing those policies over the last 2 years and really, what that looks like and vetting anything that we've used, like when we're making common formative assessments, right? We vet those and then make sure that they're standards aligned and standards based. So that's really in a K-12 world is really that governance piece with your school board and your superintendent.
Wow. Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Any other thoughts? I know we have a few more minutes left. So again, feel free to share any other personal experiences. Yes.
On the data side, PII, personally identifiable information protections, are like table stakes. And I think we're the point in with technology where if I, over the course of a conversation, share 3 or 4 bits about me, over 20 messages, you can piece that together and figure out something about me that maybe you shouldn't be able to, right? And people are going to share this information over 20 messages. They're going to share little bits here and there. And we're at a point where the technology can kind of like figure that out if a bad actor wanted to, right? So we have gone from a place where like, just don't enter your credit card number, right? To, well, if you enter little bits here and there, it becomes identifiable. And how do we handle that in the messages, in the AI generated conversation titles that all the tools have, and all the tools that these tools now link into, the SIS and payment systems and so forth, and really being careful about that, especially across a whole campus. It only takes a few mistakes for a lot of information to come out, and these are things that like keep me up at night, personally.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. We have a few final 2 minutes. We'd love to open it up again if there's any closing words, closing thoughts. Really appreciate all of the insight and the information background that you've all been providing. No, it looks like our chat is a little shy. We haven't received any questions. So again, if there is one top of mind, please feel free to drop it in the chat. Again, I know this conversation it's a heavy one. There's a lot of information that we can cover and a lot of different directions that we can go in this. We're continuing to just see AI evolve and seeing the relationships and the dynamics between the user and this tool. So I think, the more that we continue to connect with it, the more that we'll be able to really understand it and decide, how we can protect the integrity and manage the risk, and preserve that trust as well. But if there are no final thoughts, I just want to again thank the three of you so much for being a part of this panel and for sharing your insight. And thank you to everyone that hopped on. We have more exciting discussions and panels happening, so I do hope that you all stick by and hang out for those.
Thank you so much, Ari, for moderating this great conversation. I think talking about governance is really important. And while we're all here to talk about practical things and how we're using it, this is a good reminder to ground us in what the work that we're doing going forward. So thank you to all three of you for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and your participation.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you all.